The other thing that happens after those big, fast increases in dopamine, afterwards, when it quickly drops below baseline, it takes a much longer time to get back to the original baseline than it did prior to using the drug. And worse still is that the peaks in dopamine that are created from more consumption leads to progressively lower peaks and deeper troughs below baseline. So the whole system is shifting away from pleasure and more to pain and the desire for pursuit of the drug.
In a world where nobody wants to be in our world, I bring you fantasy books.
I had a guy tell me once that he would never read a fantasy book because they are nothing like the real world. Yeah, that's the whole point!
It wasn't like that, okay?
Really, what was it like? A down payment now and then a bonus for sleeping with me?
No, I didn't care about the money, okay? I cared about you.
If you remember nothing else from this episode, please remember this, that when you experience something or you crave something really desirable, really exciting to you, what happens afterwards is your baseline level of dopamine drops. Okay, so these peaks in dopamine, they influence how much dopamine will generally be circulating afterward. And you might think, oh, a big peak in dopamine, after that, I'm going to feel even better because I just had this great event. Not the case. What actually happens is that your baseline level of dopamine drops. And that's what we call addiction. Dopamine is a universal currency in all mammals, but especially in humans, for moving us toward goals. If your dopamine is too low, you will not feel motivated. If your dopamine is really high, you will feel motivated. This is important. Your experience of life and your level of motivation and drive depends on how much dopamine you have relative to your recent experience. This is, again, something that's just not accounted for in the simple language of dopamine hits. Okay? A simple way to envision dopamine hits is every time you do something you like, you eat a piece of chocolate, dopamine hit. You look at your Instagram, dopamine hit. You see someone you like, dopamine hit. You know, all these things described as dopamine hits neglect the fact that if you scroll social media and you see something you really like, dopamine hit. Sure, there's an increase in dopamine. But then you get to something else and you go, not that interesting. However, had you arrived at that second thing first, you might think that it was really interesting. If you had arrived to that second Instagram post 3 days later or 4 days later, you might find it extremely interesting. Again, how much dopamine you experience from something depends on your baseline level of dopamine when you arrive there and your previous dopamine peaks. Okay? That's super important to understand, and it's completely neglected by the general language of dopamine hits. Now that you understand how your previous level of dopamine relates to your current level of dopamine and how your current level of dopamine will influence your future level of dopamine, it should become obvious why things like pornography, not just the accessibility of pornography, but the intensity of pornography, can negatively shape real-world romantic and sexual interactions. This is a serious concern. The discussion is happening now. The underlying neurobiological mechanisms you now understand. But again, any activity that evokes a lot of dopamine release will make it harder to achieve the same level and certainly the greater level of dopamine through a subsequent interaction. So yes, indeed, many people are addicted to pornography. And yes, indeed, many people who regularly indulge in pornography experience challenges in real-world romantic interactions. You now understand the mechanisms behind what I'm telling you. You can even see this with video games. Video games, especially video games that have a very high update speed, where there's novel territory all the time, those can release dopamine somewhere between nicotine and cocaine. So very high levels of dopamine release. I always say addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. So oftentimes what will happen is the person only has excitement and can achieve dopamine release to the same extent doing that behavior and not other behaviors. And so they start losing interest in school, they start losing interest in relationships, they start losing interest in fitness. And eventually what typically happens is they will stop getting dopamine release from that activity as well. and then they drop into a pretty serious depression.
The Love Buzz Love Cannon, in effect, we'll bring that out around 10 or noon. Do you want to see the Love Cannon, actually? Sure. Yeah. Let's bring it out, just so you get a little preview. So you got the Love Buzz Love Cannon that's going to be blasting up. I brought about 5 or 10 pounds, and I'm going to blast into the atmosphere. So this is the Love Kush Cannon. Take one at the 420. Load that thing, fill it up. The Love Buzz Love Cannon at the Cannabis 420 Love Please. Let's take one of the Love Cannon. We're going to fill it up and get maybe some busted up.
And eventually what typically happens is they will stop getting dopamine release from that activity as well, and then they drop into a pretty serious depression. Some of you might be asking, what should I do if I experience a drop in my baseline level of dopamine because of engagement with some activity or some substance that led to big peaks? Actually, the child of a friend who has basically become addicted to video games. He decided, actually after seeing that episode with Anna, to do a 30-day complete fast from phone, from video games, and from social media of all kinds. He's now at day 29. He's really accomplished this. Not incidentally, his levels of concentration, his overall mood are up. He's doing far, far better. But the way that you replenish the releasable pool of dopamine is to not engage in these dopaminergic seeking behaviors. Because remember, typically people arrive at a place where they want to stop engaging in these behaviors or ingesting substances when that dopamine is depleted, when they're not getting the same lift. In his case, he was feeling depressed. He thought he had ADHD. They were starting to treat it as ADHD. But what he found was that his levels of concentration are back. He does not need to be treated for ADHD. And actually, the psychiatrist wondered if he did prior to this video game social media fast. He's feeling good. He's exercising again. I'm not making this up. This is really a very specific but very relevant example of how the dopamine system can replenish itself. So for anyone that's experienced a real drop in baseline who has addictive tendencies, whether or not they're behaviors or substances, that is always going to be the path forward, is going to be either cold turkey or through some sort of tapering to limit interactions with what would otherwise be the dopamine evoking behavior or substance.